Okay, I might get started just with my introduction if everyone feels okay. All right. Um, so good evening and welcome to the inaugural keynote of the 2021 Southern Studies Conference virtual program organized by Auburn University at Montgomery. My name is Naomi Slip and I am the conference director and an associate professor of art history. First, I would like to thank the members of the Southern Studies Conference Planning Committee for pivoting so gracefully this year to a virtual program. Andrew McMichael, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, and Kim Brackett, Associate Dean for supporting the conference, and Catherine Ashmore for managing the logistics. The conference events span from tonight through next Thursday evening and include 2 more public lectures, 2 student research panels, and a student-focused roundtable. We hope that those of you joining us tonight will elect to join us for more events. One logistical note about this evening, along with 2 colleagues, Dr. Eric Sterling and John Havard, we will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat areas. Please use those spaces to raise questions for Dr. Richardson. We will moderate the questions at the end of the talk, and if you want to be named, please also provide your name or affiliation so that we can share that as well. So I'd like to hand things over to my colleague, Dr. Eric Sterling, who will do the introduction for Dr. Richardson.
Thank you, Dr. Slip. I'm honored today to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Riché Richardson, who is from Montgomery. Dr. Richardson earned her bachelor's degree in English with a minor in philosophy and women's studies from Spelman College and her PhD in English from Duke University. She spent 10 years at the University of California, Davis as a with the Davis Humanities Institute Fellowship. Then she had an Olive B. O'Connor visiting distinguished chair at Colgate University. For the past 13 years, she has been a professor in the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University. In 2016, she was named Educator of the Year by St. Jude's alumni. Her first book, Black Masculinity in the U.S. South, From Uncle Tom to Gangsta, was published by University of Georgia Press. Her most recent book, Emancipation's Daughters, Reimagining Black Femininity and the National Body, published by Duke University Press. This is what Houston Baker said about her book. It is, quote, a brilliant gift, an impeccably crafted guide to the struggles, creativity, and iconic labors of African-American women and their emancipated daughters, end quote. She has published more than 36 articles in journals such as American Literature and Mississippi Quarterly. And she is the editor of the new Southern Studies series with University of Georgia Press. In addition to being an academic, Dr. Richardson also does art quilts. And some of them are on display at the Rosa Parks Museum. And also one is on the Quilts for Obama display at the National Exhibit in Washington. Her keynote address today is called A Now Southern Studies, the Birth of a Formation Nation. Welcome, Dr. Richardson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sterling, for such a wonderful and generous introduction. I want to give my thanks as well to Dr. Naomi Slip for all of the ways in which she has worked to bring this event together. And I'm so delighted and honored to have been invited to be a part of it, and especially in my hometown. I applaud the commitment to these ongoing dialogues in Southern Studies in general, and this is a time-honored conference and premier event in the field. So I am delighted and deeply honored to be a part of it and to be giving a talk today. I want to thank my family, friends, and classmates, everyone who's come out this evening, as well as the audience more generally, and I look forward to dialoguing during the Q&A. In general, I also appreciate and applaud the work of the planning committee. As I begin this discussion, let me just put my presentation on at this point. As I begin this discussion, that I will elaborate across 3 sections that focus thematically on the topics invoked in this talk's main title and subtitle, I want to offer a prelude that focuses on the issues that matter to so many right now, especially as an incident that could have easily been relegated to yesterday's news has become so relevant again today, in a moment of profound hope that it will not continue across tomorrows iteratively in the tone of the ones invoked in one of Macbeth's famous soliloquies. Like many people around this nation and around the world, I was horrified and shocked by the tragic murder of George Floyd by Officer Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, Minnesota on May 25, 2020, as the nation commemorated Memorial Day. In the wake of this tragedy, and in the midst of the national and global crisis of the COVID pandemic that had disrupted so many routines taken for granted in school, work, and social life, and that in some cases had led to illness and loss, widespread protests erupted in all 50 states as well as in cities around the world. They were largely led by the activist group Black Lives Matter, as many took to the streets to express outrage over what had happened, which was also risky in that moment in light of the prevailing social distancing mandates designed to protect public health. In a nation in which such deaths of Blacks at the hands of police are often rationalized and even justified, there was widespread consensus across a range of racial and ethnic categories that what happened to George Floyd was unacceptable, unconscionable, and inhumane. In the wake of the Charleston tragedy that took the lives of Reverend Clemente Pinckney at Mother Emanuel AME Church in 2015 and 8 other parishioners, in which the perpetrator had invoked the Confederate flag to rationalize his violent attack, I was invited to contribute to the Room for Debate forum in the New York Times on the question of other symbols that should also be reconsidered. In my op-ed, I drew on my research for my book, then in progress, to urge a rethinking of the Aunt Jemima image, given its roots in plantation nostalgia and romance related to the mammy stereotype, joining the long-standing critique of this symbol by artists and scholars. It felt so surreal that 5 years to the day after the Charleston tragedy, NBC Universal got in touch to interview me because of that op-ed, to revisit the very same issues because this nation was back in a similar place yet again, as this debate about symbols reemerged, with even more passion and intensity in the weeks after Floyd's death and in the midst of the widespread protests. But such issues resurfaced in that moment is just a small part of why George Floyd's death and now Derek Chauvin's related trial have held deep implications for the U.S. South, including its histories from slavery to civil rights, apart from Floyd's moorings in places from Fayetteville, North Carolina to Houston, Texas. In the midst of the media dialogues, I heard from many people, including some who seemed to be fallaciously conflating Aunt Jemima with Black women's identities and notions of their empowerment, or fond memories of meals with their families, while seeming blissfully unaware of this image's linkages to the mammy myth and romance's nostalgia related to antebellum slavery. For she is a stereotype in keeping with the types of race, sex, and gendered ideologies such as Uncle Tom that, as I argued in my first book, crystallize in the US South, but undergo nationalization and even globalization, illustrating the profound and continuing ideological influence of the US South in the nation. One of the goals of my new book, Emancipation's Daughters, was to examine the concrete contributions that Black women have made in the political realm while becoming iconic and coming to voice. To the contrary, in its course of analysis, it underscores that Aunt Jemima was a national spectacle and fiction, hyper-embodied and lacked a voice other than the one linked to the identity that her various performers fictionalized over time, which drew on the mammy stereotype steeped in antebellum slavery and was also historically commodified within performances of blackface minstrelsy. Even so, some find it very difficult to grasp how representations of this Black servant figure premised on Black oppression and inferiority do us a disservice. It was astonishing to receive a letter from one man in particular who expressed appreciation for the symbol while making a case that while some oppression persisted, Blacks caused their own oppression, as he outlined a range of racial stereotypes to back up this point, and also insisted that Rayshard Brooks deserved to die at the hands of the police at the Wendy's in Atlanta, a particularly heartbreaking, disturbing, and disappointing comment to read. He concluded by saying that anyone who could not see where he was coming from could kiss his white A. The irony is that he wasn't particularly hateful or hostile in his tone, but just seemed to want to be heard. The experience of witnessing so many well meaning people insistently uphold outdated scripts of Southern identity that no longer serve us well in this day and time, if they ever did, is something that for me underscores the urgency of not only promoting more critical thinking and reflection on the US South as a geography, but also of continuing to think with and through critical lenses provided within the field of Southern Studies, including what I have been formulating as a now Southern Studies, building upon critical methods within the new Southern Studies that have profoundly shaped my thinking and writing as a scholar. Indeed, in the best of worlds, I believe that it is important to increasingly envision and cultivate a now South that resists refractions of Southern history through romance and nostalgia and race, sex, and gendered hierarchies associated with the past, which would be a radical departure from the variegated models of the New South proliferated within an industrializing region replete with urban epicenters that nevertheless remained racially segregated and polarized, steeped in counter-modern views of blackness that failed to adequately advance civil rights movement or challenge structural racism, and insistently regressive and reactionary when dealing with issues of race. As the trial began this month, questions of whether there would be accountability for Derek Chauvin and the other officers loomed large. The questions of justice in this case were amplified all the more when considering the tragic death of Philando Castile in that city in 2016, and in the midst of the trial, the killing of the young father, Dante Wright, whose memorial service was held today. God bless his soul and family. Like many, I tracked the trial proceedings and awaited the announcement of the verdict on Tuesday. And like so many, when he was found guilty, I found myself crying in tears that justice seemed to be served and that Chauvin was being held accountable, and hoping and praying that the decision would help pave the way to needed reforms in policing and a broader commitment to achieving equal justice for Blacks and others who continue to be routinely denied rights and prerogatives linked to American citizenship. Even as it was a relief to see him held accountable for his crime, that Chauvin was willing to do something as extreme as end George Floyd's life, implicitly in service to agendas of hate and white supremacy, to the point of sacrificing his freedom, is deeply unsettling and suggests the urgency of getting to the root of such attitudes and freeing more people from such forms of spiritual and psychological bondage. One question is, how can we help more and more people to get serious about divesting from such toxic points of view on race and ethnicity? Moreover, in the wake of an incident like the recent Capitol insurrection, it is also important to raise questions about how and why understandings of citizenship and democracy have come to be so profoundly undemocratic and exclusionary in the minds of some, and premised on the exclusion of everyone perceived as being outside of the category white. The work of Nobel laureate Toni Morrison draws on histories from a more distant past than Aunt Jemima to ponder the terrain that existed for developing a true interracial democracy in this nation had a path other than a system of racial slavery been chosen. In her novel, A Mercy, set during the 1680s, during the first decades of slavery, Morrison invites us to take a look at the U.S. far back into its distant past to meditate on the period in its early history before it crystallized as a republic when it was an ad hoc place. This novel is indispensable to think with, to ponder where America could have gone and what it could have become had its system of slavery not consolidated and become racialized and had not become the dominant organizing principle during the colonial era. Like all of her work, this novel is inherently philosophical. It helps us to reflect on ontological questions related to the US as a nation, as well as its earliest dynamics of race, class, sex, and gender formation, and through its characters such as Jacob Bark, the emergence of a society in which the most privileged citizens were white, male, elite, and property, embodying the elitist notion of national manhood theorized by Dana D. Nelson. In her critical work From Playing in the Dark and the Origins of Other to her body of novels, Toni Morrison is an author who has stood at the critical forefront in pondering the implications of white and black identity categories while challenging the persistence of racism, a project that began to crystallize when post structuralist critics were grappling with the concept of race. Famously, in a 1993 interview with Charlie Rose, she remarks that the people who do this thing, who practice racism, are bereft. There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste, and it's a corruption, and it's a distortion. It is a profound neurosis that nobody examines for what it is. She points out that if you can only be tall because someone's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And I would add, or when someone is someone's neck is under your knee, and underscores that it is the responsibility of the white population to come to grips with this problem, to recognize that it exists and that they have one, and to grapple with what they are going to do about it. I'll see if we can. Let me see. I don't think this video is actually formulated to play, but a copy is actually available on YouTube. The serious critical thinking and soul searching about whiteness that she describes is urgent to do now more than ever, without falling into the pitfall of recentering whiteness, as has been the case in whiteness studies in some instances. Not only is the epistemology on race that she advanced within her novel Itinerary, which often challenged everything we think we know about it, including stereotypes, more useful than more contemporary color blindness, post-blackness, and the post-racial discourses, it is also, I suggest, crucially important and indispensable to think with and through in times like these. There's still more material from Morrison relevant to mention in framing the discussion at hand. My first academic essay, which was published in the Mississippi Quarterly in 2003, drew its title from that of Toni Morrison's Birth of a Nation Hood anthology, which draws on the title of D.W. Griffith's famous 1915 film and reflects on propensities to criminalize blackness and to portray blacks as spectacles in the media and as being violent, criminal, and other in the US by drawing on the OJ case. We witnessed it deployed most recently in the defense's attempt to criminalize George Floyd during the trial proceedings. Morrison's essay was an ideal, her essay introduction and anthology itself was an ideal framework for me, given that The Birth of a Nation was a lens through which I also ended up reading William Bradford Huey's The Klansman in this early work. Since Donald Trump's election in 2016, The Birth of a Nation has also been a primary discourse that I, like many others, have drawn on to think about his reactionary political agenda. At this point, and if American democracy will have any hope for survival, I believe that doing so is urgent right now more than ever, if only because so much, including lives, are at stake. The white supremacist fantasy in The Birth of a Nation was never just a fantasy in the pages of a novel or on cinematic screen, but some aspects of American life and politics have long imitated and reflected this art. Most recently, the nightmare that it depicts came to life in the nation's capital on January 6th. It is significant that Donald Trump's reactionary presidency and attitudes on race resuscitated forms of white supremacy in this nation that harken back to President Woodrow Wilson's sanctioning of racism at the highest level of government a century ago, a president who famously embraced Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, which romanticized the Ku Klux Klan, sanctioned lynching, and ridiculed Black political participation. Such contexts, particularly in light of anxieties about the Black majority of South Carolina in a political arena where Blacks vote and make Negro rule conceivable, are important to draw on in thinking about Trump's agenda and the work witnessed in the political arena to undermine and repress Black voting rights. In a year during which we commemorated 100 years of women's suffrage and witnessed the passing of the iconic civil rights leader John Lewis, who was famously beaten in Selma in 1965 as he protested for voting rights. Blatant efforts to undermine the voting rights of American citizens on the road to the presidential election eerily recollected strategies of voter suppression in the Jim Crow South. The voting rights activism of 2018 Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams stood at the vanguard and played a key role in flipping the state blue in the recent presidential election and in the Senate election in Georgia that elected Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff as the first Black and Jewish senators in the state's history, respectively. Indeed, the moment has been interpreted by some as one that stoked racial anxieties like those visible in this film about an empowered Black electorate and white minority, and the steps that the nation continues to make toward becoming a true interracial democracy, a nation that has become increasingly more diverse and multicultural. There's so much going on in the US and in the global context right now that underscores the importance of a viable Southern studies, including areas such as the New Southern Studies, the Global South, and the Hemispheric South. Again, I believe that the research of this field is indispensable for analyzing contemporary dynamics within the complex political and cultural arena. Southern literature as a field has tended to be marginal within American literature. It long remained invested in a very narrow notion of its canon, arguing that a Southern birthplace defines Southern literature. It is argued that the South as a place is distinctive. It frequently used the Civil War as its main temporal point of reference for defining the South, as well as geographical indicators such as the North and South in the United States. It has also often been invested in heavily in notions of Southern nostalgia and romance. The New Southern Studies, however, has had a very different orientation. The New Southern Studies was a paradigm and framework introduced by Houston A. Baker Jr. and Dana D. Nelson in a special issue of American Literature, and its methods mirrored many of the exciting and cutting edge theoretical methods related to studying race, gender, class, sexuality, and nationality that were increasingly crystallizing and revolutionizing the field. Of Southern Studies as the new millennium began. Eventually, John Smith and I were approached by the University of Georgia Press about editing a series, and we inaugurated one entitled The New Southern Studies. It has attempted to unsettle the hegemony of Northern America in defining notions of Southernness. The point, though, is that it is necessary for U.S. Southerners to look outside the region beyond the United States. Postcolonialism has been central in the reconstruction of Southern studies. Some scholars have argued that the U.S. South, in light of its plantation culture, has more in common with formerly colonized areas of the Caribbean, and so it is important to explore those intersections. No text has been more salient in shaping these dialogues in Southern studies, which have also included dialogues on the Global South, than William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom, published in 1936. It is significant is that the cadre of slaves that built the patriarch Thomas Sutpen's Hundred came from Haiti. And there are also clear connections between this character and Morrison's Jacob Bark that I think are interesting to think and talk about, who I mentioned earlier in this talk. Recent scholarship under the banner of scholars like Edouard Glissant has suggested that one should look as much to Haiti to understand an author like Faulkner as to Yakavatafa, Mississippi. Like Baker's Turning South again, I critically underscore the value of reflecting on the region, including in global perspective, in my 2003 essay entitled Southern Turns. In general, I believe that Southern studies must be responsive to the issues of the day and seriously ponder the U.S. South in terms of what it is, where it is, and why it matters while moving beyond essentialist definitions. I believe in an everyday Southern studies, a Southern studies that helps us to understand and grapple with the yesterdays, todays, and tomorrows while affirming its potential to pave the way toward new futures, including Afro futures and places that are at once new, old, and timeless, like Wakanda, or like the worlds that Beyonce imagines in Lemonade. I believe that the new Southern studies are even more important and urgent now than they were when they emerged at the dawn of the millennium. The new Southern studies for me has been a vital site for developing research questions that are simultaneously rooted in Black and Africana studies, African American literature, American studies, Black feminism and gender studies, Black queer and trans studies, and Southern studies. Studying the South was the foundation within the architecture of my career, a path on which it was important to prioritize thinking and writing on the region and to draw on the wealth of a new Southern Studies, clearly information that reflected a Southern Studies and transformation not bound by the traditionalism and biases of the past. Indeed, I entered the field at a time when many scholars were talking and thinking about Malcolm X's identification of Mississippi as being anywhere in the US below the Canadian border and advancing the discourse on the global South while challenging the conventional temporalities and geographies linked to Southern landscapes, as well as the conceivable archives for research and study and the types of questions formulated. That's one of the reasons that I ended up working on the Dirty South rap movement in my first book. In thinking through incidents from the insurrection at the Capitol to the newest efforts to forestall Black voting rights, a new Southern Studies perhaps isn't even as important or urgent at this point as a now Southern Studies, which I first mentioned in my keynote at Humboldt University in Berlin back in January. That is now in the sense that Stacey Abrams means it in her landmark book entitled Our Time Is Now. In her landmark book entitled Our Time Is Now, Stacey Abrams argues that, quote, we must embrace identity politics if we are to save our democracy and thrive, underscoring that mobilizing with consideration of identity allows a clearer recognition of what's most urgently needed among various citizens. I wholeheartedly agree with her. A Southern Studies that fails to confront identity questions head on, as far as I'm concerned, fails us. Right now, I believe that it is particularly urgent to formulate approaches in Southern Studies that acknowledge and address questions of identity, to underscore the importance and indispensability of thinking about Black identity and to adequately address the current political moment, and to achieve a more inclusive and diverse American democracy. In spite of the limitations and potential uses and abuses of the concept of intersectionality, I believe that a Southern Studies that fails to recognize the value of identity, politics, and intersectionality in the vein of the epistemology on the non-South, which urges a divestment from all notions of Southern identity and culture, is escapist, apolitical, and perhaps unconsciously anti-Black, even while making a well-meant effort to challenge persisting white racism and notions of nostalgia in the South. Promoting more literacy and understanding about intersectionality seems all the more important and urgent in the wake of the mass shooting at spas in Atlanta that primarily targeted multiple Asian women, and witnessing media dialogues that pondered whether they were targeted for their race or gender, failing to understand how much the categories and experiences related to them are imbricated, failing to recognize or conceptualize how this incident fit the definition of a hate crime. Moreover, I believe that the principles of public engagement and community engagement that have increasingly been prioritized in higher education are equally relevant to fully embrace within Southern Studies. This field is equipped to play a leading role in the public sphere, and the voices of its scholars need to be at the forefront of public dialogues on the South precisely because they are the product of such diligent and focused training in research and teaching in the field, and deep systematic thinking, and so well informed with scholars and students who have a panoramic view and wealth of knowledge about relevant resources and archives. This dimension, in terms of the public impact of Southern Studies, ended up at the epicenter of dialogues about academic freedom last fall in the wake of Garrett Felber's firing at the University of Mississippi, an assistant professor of history, because he spoke out on the failure to accept grants designed to help the incarcerated, called out other racial politics at his institution, which made the moment unsettling in part because it is also incidentally one of the major epicenters of Southern Studies and the locus of some of the best and most visionary critical thought and innovation in the field. I certainly have become who I have become as an intellectual in Southern Studies because of the support and encouragement of scholars and resources at institutions such as the University of Mississippi. The plight of Professor Felber suggests how much more work remains to be done to bring about change to ensure institutional climates that are safe and welcoming for all faculty and that respect academic freedom. How possible is it, even, we might ask, to fashion a Southern Studies in this day and time that is tolerant of a range of political ideas, from liberal to conservative, a question that seems particularly important given, again, the importance of protecting academic freedom, including freedom of speech, and that avoids silencing or alienating some scholars and citizens. Earlier, I invoked the nativist racialist narrative of national identity in the US that D.W. Griffith promoted through his propaganda film, whose residual effects continue to be felt in the persisting antipathy toward Black voting and political participation in the US and the proliferation of extremist hate groups, to the point that white domestic terrorism has been acknowledged as an acute threat to national security. At this point, and while drawing on some of my research in Beyonce studies, that I introduced in Emancipation's Daughters and that's also forthcoming, I wanted to shift gears again and analyze ways in which the music and video artistry of the iconic singer Beyonce from Houston, Texas, has promoted a counter narrative to this toxic political climate and nativist narrative of nationhood by staging a vision of a democracy that includes blacks as citizens, as well as through her embodiments of national femininity in the popular realm. I argue that she builds upon the iconicity that Black women leaders, and most recently Kamala Harris, established in politics throughout the 20th century and into the new millennium. And we might add Stacey Abrams and a range of other figures as well. Her artistry engages political movements from the past decade, from Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name to Take a Knee, as well as Mothers of the Movement, which is linked to Black women whose children have been murdered by police and vigilantes, including Trayvon Martin. In my research, I focus on her recent productions such as Formation and Homecoming, the latter of which is particularly interesting to ponder when recognizing how figures from HBCUs and Black Greek organizations such as Harris and Raphael Warnock, along with Abrams, are continuing and building upon the long legacy of such institutions in shaping politics as leaders, as well as various aspects of Black liberation movement. And of course, in Montgomery, there's Alabama State and then nearby Tuskegee University that have long celebrated the Turkey Day Classic and advanced HBCU traditions more locally. And so, but nationally, it seems that the conversation has shifted to reflect on the implications of HBCUs in shaping politics, and how I think it's interesting myself that so many leaders um, at the heart of this movement have been cultivated at HBCUs. We can think of contemporary people like Otis Moss and Sean King and Lee Merritt, just to range Eddie Glaude, and many, many who are, front and center in the national conversation. But then, in thinking of the past, there's Dr. King, there's Julian Bond, there's John Lewis. So a whole long legacy, I think, to consider. And so Beyonce's homecoming especially is important for registering and giving salience to HBCU communities and campuses within the national mainstream. So I'm not discussing the homecoming part today, but formation. It is useful to study Beyonce through the lens of the New Southern Studies because she has staged one of the most dramatic Southern turns that we have witnessed in recent years. Moreover, given her self-naming as Texas Bama in formation, she embodies and articulates new notions of Southern subjectivity that were inconceivable and illegible in the past. The New Southern Studies' insurgent, unconventional thinking about questions of geography and identity embraces such fluid framings of regional identity that are premised on regional, racial, and cultural hybridity and intermixtures. Beyonce's original and insurgent intersectional identity, which she affirms in formation by citing her parents' origins in Texas and Alabama, invokes internal patterns of Black migration in the South and belies conventional notions of Southern identity that have been premised on geographical fixity. I also draw on Africana studies, focusing on the Africana Southwest in particular. And of course, Beyonce's father, Dr. Matthew Knowles, is an Alabama native. He has been really very supportive of my teaching and research in the field of Beyonce studies, and it's been really wonderful to hear his insights and perspectives as I've done this research. And so that's another way I think that this work comes home again in just interesting ways. Beyonce's invocation of contemporary activist movements from Black Lives Matter to Take a Knee affirms Southern connections to civil rights histories along with newer Black political movements while acknowledging afterlives and continuing traumas related to slavery and Jim Crow. Her reminder and formation of the continuing significance of the tragedy of Hurricane Katrina and the devastation that it wrought for predominantly Black communities in New Orleans and the Gulf regions of Louisiana and Mississippi was coupled with the centering of Black women's political agency in the U.S. South. That the political climate in the U.S. South has remained at the forefront in advancing some of the nation's most regressive and reactionary policies on issues such as immigration and voting rights underscores why it remains a battleground on which to fight for freedom and civil rights to help bring about social and political change. While Southern regional themes were evident in Beyonce's artistry from her days in Destiny's Child, they erupted in full force with Formation, the first hit single released from the Lemonade album. And I want to underscore that evolution. Like one aspect of my work in Beyonce studies, this different, is that I take the long view of Beyonce and the South. I think that a lot of scholars have presumed that Lemonade was Beyonce's initial confrontation and engagement with Southern identity, but I argue in my forthcoming work about Beyonce that this has been going on for a long time and talk about her Texas roots and how much an icon like Farrah Fawcett helped to establish foundations even for her nationalization later on. Like the iconicity and commodification of Beyonce in the early 2000s and from that point on was very similar to how Farrah Fawcett was commodified and named America's sweetheart. You know, that Beyonce and the other members of Destiny's Child presented the Independent Women Part 1 video and as a paean to Charlie's Angels, all of that I think is significant. They also performed at the inauguration of George W. Bush. And so it's not like Beyonce began to reflect on the South yesterday. And so I think that's important if we're going to recognize the just even patterns in her artistry that have evolved over time. In this project, she positions Southern identity as being core to her identity as a race and gendered subject, drawing on it to challenge narrow and exclusionary notions of American selfhood. In Formation, profuse invocations of Black Southern identity assert a narrative of Beyonce's background that centers Blackness, which complicated and to some extent contradicted the colorblind narratives of her history previously circulated in the media. Formation helped shape the subversive and inclusive notion of Blackness that Beyonce boldly showcased in the video and during her performance before a national audience at the 2016 Super Bowl halftime show, heralding her activism related to issues such as racial profiling and police violence against Blacks. At the same time, it established foundations for her increasing commitment to showcasing Black community traditions and institutions evident in more recent projects such as her homecoming show at the Coachella Music Festival in 2018. The release of the Formation video on the eve of Super Bowl 50 halftime show heralded a radical turn within Beyonce's repertoire and a more assertive engagement with the U.S. South that had been evident in the past. Its lyrics most saliently invoked the region by framing Beyonce's identity in relation to her Creole mother's roots in Louisiana and her Negro fathers in Alabama, autobiographically positioning Beyonce as a byproduct of this geographical and genetic fusion that she terms Texas Bama. As Jenna Wortham notes in the dialogue on Formation in the New York Times, this neologism is all the more significant because it unsettles uses of the term Bama as a lethal insult. Most typically, this term has been used in Black urban contexts as an epithet to make fun of people regarded as tacky and country, as illustrated in several scenes in Spike Lee's 1987 film School Days. The setting of the video Formation in New Orleans and its featuring of the singer atop police car that sinks as the video ends critiques the neglect of the city after it was hit by Hurricane Katrina, had its levees break, and flooded in 2005. It is significant that Beyonce's Formation revisited this tragedy over a decade later at a point when it was increasingly receding in memory. Hurricane Katrina and the horrific losses of life that followed in its wake are invoked by a line at the beginning of the song, sampled by the late gender nonconforming local commentator Messi Maya. The assertive voice that follows belongs to the Black queer hip-hop and bounce musician Big Freedia, also a New Orleans native who established a tone of empowerment in the song, paradoxically by underscoring Beyonce's fierceness among quote-unquote bitches and a rival to slay. Such terms further link the song's message to Black queerness linguistically and signal Beyonce's embrace of Black queer and trans communities, while Big Freedia's voiceover implications of soul foods such as cornbread and collard greens rooted in the South as a region. Beyonce's acknowledgement of the hot sauce in my bag and assertion that she has remained country in spite of her money also play upon Southern themes. However, the visual dimensions of the video play a critical role in rendering Louisiana as a place that is both visceral for viewers in the new millennium and a site of lingering trauma. Images of a black college marching band and black churches emphasize Southern heritage as the camera pans through the areas of New Orleans that were most devastated by Hurricane Katrina and have yet to recover, underscoring the storm's continuing impact on the landscape. History is brought to life as well in Beyonce's multi-layered portraits of black women and girls dressed in white that recall antebellum styles and traditions associated with black Creole women, as well as embodiments of black womanhood compellingly visualized by Julie Dash's film Daughters of the Dust. Plantation-style settings, such as the Fayez Mansion in Pasadena, California, also invoke this history. As John Monica suggests, Beyonce is both old and New South. Simultaneously, the Formation video indicts the pervasive killings in the contemporary era of African Americans at the hands of law enforcement, which have typically gone unpunished. The culmination of Formation brings these themes full circle with images of the police car sinking with Beyonce atop it, a youth to whom officers raise their hands in surrender, and a voice that shows the words "Stop Killing Us" written in graffiti. This bold theme fueled a backlash against the singer that resulted in the police boycotting several of her performances in cities such as Miami, Florida, and her hometown, Houston, Texas. In an April 2006 interview with Elle magazine, Beyonce addressed such protests by commenting, "I'm an artist, and I think the most powerful art is usually misunderstood." The provocative contours of the Formation video were the backdrop for Beyonce's performance at Super Bowl 50, which in a game at Levi's Stadium in the San Francisco Bay Area paid tribute to the Black Panther Party on the 50th anniversary of its founding in Oakland, California. In the halftime show, performances by Coldplay and Bruno Mars set the stage for Beyonce's segment, which began when she entreated her fellow women dancers to get in formation. The dancers styling in black leather bodysuits and berets directly referenced the Black Panthers, whose leather jackets and berets became iconic in photography and television during the late 1960s. Their afros also referenced this period when the Black Power movement had helped popularize natural afro hairstyles and emphasized Black beauty, while also visually building on Beyonce's assertion of her adoration of her daughter Blue Ivy's afro hair in the song's lyrics. Notably, Beyonce and her dancers configured their bodies to form an X, which paid tribute to the Black Muslim leader Malcolm X, who played a key role in inspiring Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale to found the Black Panthers in 1966. The dancers' formation both enacted Beyonce's opening entreaty and, together with the song's lyrics, echoed the militaristic formations in which the organization's members drilled to learn armed self-defense. Their nearly unison choreography was punctuated at the beginning by a raised fist. This moment arguably rests in the continuum with John Carlos and Tommy Smith's famous salute to Black Power during the national anthem at the 1968 Olympics, and it anticipated the incendiary critiques of police violence staged later in 2016 by Jesse Williams and Colin Kaepernick. The culmination of the performance against the backdrop of a video that included Black singers who had starred in earlier Super Bowl halftime shows such as James Brown, Stevie Wonder, Whitney Houston, Prince, and Michael Jackson saliently invoked the themes of Black History Month when Super Bowl 50 took place. Both the Formation video and the song's performance at the Super Bowl as a paean to the Black Panthers underline the long history of Black resistance to anti-Black violence and policing. It connected the Black Panthers' founding to abusive policing in Black communities and its long-standing critique of police brutality with the work of political groups such as Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name in protesting contemporary police abuses. Indeed, the latter hashtag echoes the popular song by Destiny's Child, Say My Name, one of its anthems for women's empowerment. Beyonce's use of Black Panther iconography in her performances lies in a continuum with its citations within Black popular culture, from Tupac Shakur's video California Love to musical performances and scenes in the television drama Empire. I'm thinking of when Lucius as a character is released from prison. He's echoing the Free Huey campaign. The roots of this organization in Alabama's Black Belt and the impact of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, founded by Stokely Carmichael in 1965 to support Black voter registration on its emergence, link it organically to the South, and in this sense also reinforce the Southern epistemology invoked within formation. In formation, the South's ongoing traumas of slavery and Jim Crow are recollected in atrocities such as anti-Black police violence in the contemporary era. The song depicts not simply a Black Southern history, but American history itself, in which Beyonce scripts herself as a symbolic subject who has reached the pinnacle of success. She accomplishes the task of embodying national selfhood by remaining grounded in her Texas Bama identity, staying closely moored to her family of origin and continuing to honor and pay tribute to Southern legacies while also claiming new dimensions of her identity as a wife and mother. In the Formation video and Super Bowl performance, Beyonce underscores the utility of embracing alternative and hidden histories and challenges her audiences to envision the United States as a nation where white supremacy is not always centering its definitions of national selfhood. Beyonce's epistemology on the South has become increasingly central to her artistry and aesthetics, presenting a counter-narrative to purist, nativist, white-centered notions of American identity. And to conclude, Beyonce's artistry has been profoundly shaped by her backgrounds in the U.S. South. A nuanced examination of such themes within her work can help us appreciate the foundations on which her engagements with the region have developed and how they have evolved and expanded over time. Beyonce richly demonstrates the potential for Black women to embody national models of femininity in the United States while making legible new Black Southern diasporas and identities. Of course, invoking the U.S. South as an essential home in the project of constructing Blackness, including Black femininity, can risk replaying nostalgic and romantic formulations of Black identity that obscure how the region also remains a site of continuing trauma and entrenched racial and social inequalities. Nevertheless, the latest Southern turns in Beyonce's work are perhaps the greatest yet, in acknowledging the region's regressive racialist politics from slavery to Jim Crow, while also birthing a new kind of nation, paving the way toward a more inclusive politics of race, sexuality, gender, and nation formation, in which Beyonce and we too can sing America in the sense that the poet Langston Hughes dreamed. And as I really am, again, so thankful to have been able to talk to you all today. Thank you so much for your patience as I've delivered this talk. And as I say in the acknowledgments of Emancipation's Daughters, in the vein of the iconic Dorothy, there's no place like home.
Many thanks to Dr. Richardson for her presentation and for joining us at the Southern Studies Conference this year. We do have some time for questions. You could either post questions in the Q&A, and I can ask Dr. Richardson those questions, or if you raise your hand, Dr. Slip can unmute you. Okay, I do see one hand up. Evie, Dr. Slip, could you unmute Evie? Okay, I believe you could speak now, Evie.
Thank you for this thought-provoking presentation. And I wonder how much of the depth and complexity of your analysis resonates beyond the academic environment, because of course what you're proposing is so dynamic and so provocative and so meaningful in our times for a performer who is perceived in political terms by academics who are attuned to the political implications of her work. But do you have a sense of how much the complexity of the multi-layered implications of her work resonates with audiences at large? Beyonce's, I mean,
Yeah,
work. Thank you.
Yes, yes, this is a really great question. Well, I think that one reason she has a unique ability to resonate with a broader audience than has been typical for many, say, Black women in the United States in the past is because she achieved such widespread and global success to begin with, and um, got to that status of being a global pop artist, and to the point that she's been so often celebrated as the nation's sweetheart. And so this was really one of the earliest scripts of Beyonce as she transitioned to a solo singing career. And I think that the nationalization um, and even scripting as America's sweetheart persisted in the first years of the Obama administration. And so, in a way, it provided um, a, a foundation for her to make the transition to more direct political messages. And so, in a way, she's been the voice, I would say, of a mainstream political movement that's been growing over the past decade since the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012 at the hands of Zimmerman. The I think another layer though is that we always have to think about the broader relevance of Southern studies beyond academia. I feel that critically speaking, the field itself is just so relevant as an interpretive lens for a lot of the public debates, and so that's one of the reasons that I underscore the importance of public engagement within Southern studies, and making those larger community connections, because I feel that the field has a unique perspective to offer given the primary engagement of so many of the South's archives, and that the region, we've studied for a long time how um, the South has been serviceable at the national level in advancing and shaping ideologies. I think that's very true even to this day. I mean, even what happened in Texas with um, the the weather and the power grid back in February, when as a result of a kind of implicit states' rights posture of staying off the national power grid, there was the just the disaster really that happened in the state of Texas at the environmental level with the weather, and there was the precedent in 2011. And so you know the what happens in the South echoes nationally and always has a national impact. And so that's another reason that it's important for there to be adequate interpretation of its widespread cultural influence so that it will be properly framed and understood.
Do we have more questions? Dr. Slip herself has a question.
Thanks so much. Thank you for this really rich and layered talk. I think you outlined so many of the different ways that the scholarship and uh, visual culture that you're thinking about really overlay each other with these urgent political questions and events. And I'm really moved by the way that you describe, what happens in the South echoes nationally. And you were describing early in the talk about how, Toni Morrison's work in many ways really presents a kind of attempt to historically or fictionally revise US histories. And I wonder, this is, thinking about how you're thinking about Beyonce's work, but then also thinking about other kind of popular visual culture right now. So things like Lovecraft Country, right? Or like these other pieces of popular culture that seem to be doing similar work. Do you see kind of a wider body of visual popular culture that is attempting to revise or revision the South in productive ways or in similar ways to how you're thinking about Beyonce?
I think it's a phenomenon that is constantly happening, and one way to understand it is that it is unfolded in waves to the point of, I think, recurrently coming and going. Like when Houston Baker published Turning South Again in 2003, and I wrote Southern Turns as an essay that reflected a certain cultural moment in which there seemed to be all of this interest in the US South in an academic sense, and then also in a cultural sense, including in popular culture. And so those speak on moments of engaging the South very saliently are, have been there over time. But in terms of, sustained engagements, it's not always been the case. Um, and so the subjective look is significant. I've argued in my own work, for instance, in the discourse of the Dirty South rap movement. I mean, I really love what the scholar Regina Bradley is doing on the group Outcast, and the layered way in which she's underscoring how relevant this rap group has been to as a lens for exploring like American culture and cultural dynamics and even movements like Afrofuturism. And so, yes, we don't necessarily just have to use Beyonce. There are so many paths, to kind of making some of these inferences. But it just is interesting to me that because she grew up in Houston, Texas, in a more modern kind of South, and has increasingly reclaimed and embraced the South and showcased it in her artistry says a lot. But there are so many paths that we can look at. Our own um, Octavia Spencer, I think, is just really remarkable. As far as like um, making just these powerful contributions in acting and representing just so well. In my teaching, I have looked at what is veritably a renaissance of Black women writers in the South. My course, New Black Women Writers in the 21st Century, that I'm teaching at Cornell now, it's just been really incredible. Today, actually, our guest was my friend and Spelman's sister, the novelist Tiari Jones. And she's doing exciting work. When I think of her project, An American Marriage, the novel that's now being made into a film, and using the African American, story as a kind of lens to think through issues of marriage more generally. So in literature, there are so many wonderful and remarkable contributions that are being made by Black Southern women. My Princeton colleague Imani Perry, who's also an Alabama native from Birmingham, is just really outstanding, and her genius is just so inspiring. You have just and across fields, I think that's true. Like with my own cousin, Catherine Coleman Flowers. We have to celebrate her, actually. She's in Montgomery, my goodness, and is a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant this year, and also now in the administration of President Biden. So there are just so many exciting things going on in so many different places, that are based in the South but have a profoundly national influence and significance. I really feel it's a kind of renaissance and a very exciting time.
Time perhaps for one more question. We have a comment, actually. It occurs to me that it would be not a question, but it occurs to me that it would be incredibly interesting to pair this topic up with our new faculty member in comm who studies K-pop and images of Koreans, and to frame these discussions of musical culture within the context of hate crimes and public perceptions of race and racial justice. That's our dean, Dr. McMichael. Would you like to speak to that at all to conclude the session, Dr. Richardson?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that that's just like it's the right direction, that it's just the direction that we need to go in. You know, when we think of, again, you know, how profoundly influential popular culture has been in shaping politics. That's one of the points that scholars such as Mark Anthony Neal have made in their work, and that I echo and reiterate at the end of Emancipation's Daughters and talking about Beyonce. And so we can't ignore even the context of popular culture because it's so influential. And it's also that site that is inherently global, shared by a global audience. And so it's one of those phenomena that shrink the world and make it smaller and bring, you know, so many groups and kinds of people into dialogue. So you're thinking about, say, the tragedy in Atlanta, again, with the mass shooting that primarily targeted Asian American women, and how that incident was discussed in the aftermath, one realizes the profound, like how profoundly lacking our publics are in terms of understanding about Asian American culture in some cases. And of course, you know, Asian Americans, like Latinx populations, have increasingly diversified the U.S. South and contributed to even new scripts of the South that are much more dynamic. So I feel it's a responsibility that we have to really reflect very seriously on what, you know, these various groups bring, including the Korean American population and all of the ways in which, you know, certain groups can also be routinely targeted and pathologized. You know, we've seen those issues surface in very problematic ways during this time of pandemic. And so have to ask ourselves those questions, because to the extent that anyone is targeted by hate or violence of any kind, it's a problem. As Dr. King famously remarked, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that's something that none of us should forget.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Richardson again for joining us at the AUM Southern Studies Conference. And those were appropriate concluding remarks. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you all for having me.